Hello. Welcome to what has served as my classroom now for a number of months. My name is Marsha Collins. I'm a professor of comparative literature in the Department of English and Comparative Literature at UNC Chapel Hill. But I'm also a Hispanist, and most of my research focuses on 16th and 17th century literature, Spanish literature and culture in its European context. So today, it should come as no surprise that since we can't go there in person, I'd like for us to take a little journey, a virtual journey to Spain and to a particularly beautiful city, and that's the city of Toledo. Now, I don't have much time with you, so I had to pick and choose what to talk about, and there's so many wonderful things to see and do there in Toledo. So I want to focus on three aspects of the city. The first is talking about Toledo, has to do with Toledo as the imperial city. The second is Toledo as the city of three cultures. It's also known in that way. And finally, I want to share with you a few thoughts about one of the great native sons of Toledo, and that's the wonderful painter El Greco, who of course was not really a native son because he was not from there originally, but he has been forever identified with that city. So let's get started, shall we? So let's take a brief trip then to Toledo. I thought we would start with one of the many beautiful panoramic views of Toledo. And you know, the ancient Romans called Toledo Toletum. We believe that it is after the Celtic word tol, which means hill. And as early as 200 BCE, there are Roman historians who talk about the settlement of Celtic tribes in this area, in this particularly beautiful spot, also with easy access to fresh water. Now, the river that you see that flows through the city of Toledo is the Tajo, or we call it in English, the Tagus River. You probably know it as a much broader river, actually, because it winds its way westerly and eventually empties into the Atlantic Ocean. Now, the old city, which is what you are staring at here, you can see is a walled city. And these particular walls date from the 16th century. Although in places, by the way, you can see actually remnants of the old Roman wall that was there. And then, of course, between the 5th and the 8th centuries, this city was under Arabic rule, and there are a lot more details and spaces where you can see that particular wall as well. So, but most of it dates from the 16th century. The river name, by the way, of Tajo or Tagus in English, we believe comes from the Latin verb tagliare, which means to cut. And of course, the river cuts through these beautiful hills. So let's talk a little bit about Toledo as the imperial city. And I can think of no better spot to start than at the Bisagra Gate, which was built in 1559. But before we get to that, let's talk very briefly about some historical changes that took place in Toledo over the years. So the Romans ruled Toledo for many, many years. And the city of Toledo became, in fact, a major municipality for the Romans. And there was a circus there, one of the largest outside of Rome. The citizens had full Roman citizenship. And by the way, as early as that, Toledo steel, which I'm sure you all have heard of, was famous to the Romans as well. And they were first on the receiving end of the Toledo steel, of swords made of Toledo steel during the Punic Wars, when from the forces of Hannibal, the same was came for the Alps, and accompanied by elephants. But apparently the Roman soldiers did not like being on the receiving end of these great Toledo swords, and they said, we need some swords like that. And so the Roman legions actually ended up, all of them, being supplied by swords that were made in Toledo. The steel, we believe, was already in 500 BCE, was known for its exceptional quality. And how good is it? Well, my understanding is, this is not my area of expertise, but my understanding is that it is comparable to steel that is made today. And so obviously without any of the technology we have, that's quite an impressive achievement. So back to the Bisagra Gate. When the Roman Empire eventually crumbled, as you may remember, there were Gothic tribes, Germanic tribes that came from various types that came down from the north and sort of, invaded this area as the Roman Empire lost its power and its control over its constituent components. And so there was a Germanic tribe known as the Visigoths who settled in this part of Spain. And Toledo was under Visigothic rule then between the 5th and the 8th century. And it was really served as the capital city of their holdings. And it's important to know too, that the Visigoths actually were Christians. So Christianity sort of reigned supreme as the primary religion in this area. But then in 711, the Arabic forces from actually from northern Africa invaded the Iberian Peninsula, and eventually taking over what would be about 2/3 of the Iberian Peninsula today, including the area of Toledo and even farther north than that. And so a large part of what is present-day Spain was under Muslim rule between 711 and 1492, when the United Christian forces under Ferdinand and Isabel finally drove them off the peninsula at the very famous Battle of Granada. So, but that's 7 years in which the Muslims ruled this area. And once again, there was an area, a section that was in a sense almost a separate Arabic kingdom known as the Taifa. And Toledo, of course, was the major city, the major municipality there. And at that time, you had the 3 religions, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, different populations all living together within the walls of the city. And I will get to that in a bit. So what you see before you is actually what has become the most, one of the most photographed spots of the city. It is the Bisagra Gate, and this is from an even later period. And this is a gate that, in a sense, pays tribute to the Habsburg Emperor Charles V. And he was the grandson of Ferdinand and Isabel. They were his maternal grandparents. And among other things, when he inherited these Spanish holdings through them, the Habsburg dynasty then ruled hundreds of years and were the imperial family that we associate with the global empire of Spain. And they, of course, were an Austrian family. And what you see over this, something that it is a gate, but it looks also a little bit like a triumphal arch, and that's done deliberately, is the coat of arms of Charles V. And those of you who are familiar with this emblem, this coat of arms, it is the Austrian symbol of the family. And of course, the most dominant part of it are this two-headed, this sort of Janus of the facing eagle that is the imperial bird, so to speak, representing the power and the majesty and the might of the Habsburgs. And then the shield in there that is sort of embraced or by the backs of these eagles. You cannot see it from here, but there are different sort of, in the quadrants, there are different symbols that represent the holdings of Charles V. And this particular gate was designed by an architect in the area, Alonso de Covarrubias, who was very, very active in this area, and it built a lot of the major monuments from that time. Now, the other thing I want to add is that as the imperial city, in the 1560s, the decision was made to start building what was really a tiny little market town at that point, which was Madrid, into the new capital. But until then, Toledo was really the sort of de facto capital of Spain. And throughout the 16th and into the 17th century, there was a tremendous amount of power and wealth concentrated in and around this city. A lot of the most famous and most wealthy and most influential families of aristocrats lived in the area. And also this was the center of the church, which wielded a tremendous amount of power and wealth at the time. And so there was actually a lot of patronage, a lot of money that flowed from these aristocrats and from the royal family itself, as well as ecclesiastical authorities, to build monuments and to invest in decorations and paintings and tapestries and so forth. So let's talk a little bit about Toledo as the city of three cultures. So once upon a time, during the period of under Arabic rule, the inhabitants were sort of lived in different quarters, and they were separated more or less by religious faith. But at least so the story goes, that people rubbed along rather well together. There was an atmosphere of tolerance that seems to have existed for a period of time when people were allowed to practice their religion. They were, at least in theory, guaranteed the same rights under the law, and they were able to do business together. They, work together and so forth. And, one of the definite symbols that we have of this that we know for a fact existed was that under Christian rule in the 13th century, King Alfonso X, known as the Wise, Alfonso el Sabio, so that's the Wise, he put together a school of translators, which consisted of the best scholars of the era, and this was in Toledo, and some of them were Muslim, some of them were Christian, and some of them were Jewish in terms of faith. And these scholars were able to work together to try to consolidate and translate all of the most important knowledge of the time into Old Castilian, which is, of course, the basis for the modern Spanish language. So you go from that to about 150 years later, then, in the late 14th century, there were a tremendous number of pogroms or of horrible massacres in which most of the Jewish population in Toledo was slaughtered. So, how do you move from one to the other in a span of less than 150 years? And that I don't know. This is a matter of, as I've said, of controversy and debate that is still going on. But I can think of no better monument to demonstrate the confluence of these three cultures artistically and culturally than what is known as the Synagogue of Saint Mary the White. Now, this synagogue was built in the 12th century when the Toledo was once again under Christian rule. But the Christian king at that time apparently commissioned a group of Islamic architects and builders to design and build a synagogue, which, of course, at that time bore a different name, and for the Jewish population of the city, for them to practice their faith. And there is another synagogue as well in Toledo. But this one, I think, is particularly beautiful. So a Christian king ordering Islamic architects and builders to build a Jewish synagogue. And that there you have it. And this is the beautiful result. So what you first notice, or what it strikes me, is that, at first glance, it really looks more like a mosque than a synagogue or a church, which it eventually became a Christian church. So you have these beautiful horseshoe arches. Notice the Corinthian capitals there of Greco-Roman heritage, which are much more commonly seen in Christian architecture, appropriated for building churches. And this is, you're looking at the apse, which is where you find this scallop shell. And I know some of you are familiar with this scallop shell as a symbol, actually, of the patron saint of Spain, who is St. James. However, in this context, it does not symbolize that. The scallop shell actually is original to the building when it was a synagogue. And the scallop shell was a sort of typical ornamental piece that would be built into an apse, a sort of semicircle there. It fit the space very well. But we also think in this case that it might actually be symbolic of Queen Helen, who converted to Judaism. And one of the gifts I think it was around the year 30, right, of the Common Era. And she was known for making beautiful gifts. She was very generous. And to the Jerusalem temple, one of the great gifts she gave was a golden candlestick. And there's a description, actually, of how the light emanates from that candlestick. So we think that perhaps this scallop shell commemorates Queen Helen's candlestick, the great gift to the Jerusalem temple. In any case, originally, this is where the Torah Ark would have been kept. And then much later, after it was a synagogue, and in the wake of those horrible massacres that occurred, this building was reconsecrated as a Christian church. And it then became St. Mary the White. And, unfortunately, it's called St. Mary the White because the thinking at the time, this is around 1405 when it was reconsecrated, the thinking was that that the whiteness of St. Mary would wipe out the dark past of this building's service as a synagogue for the Jewish people of the city. Now, if you would like to read more about this controversy, there is a growing bibliography, already rather extensive, but growing bibliography on this topic. These are two of the better known books, and both of these scholars are superb scholars, and yet they take very, very different views on this concept of these members of the three Abrahamic religions and how well they actually got along during the period we know as medieval Spain. Finally, I'd like for us to talk a little bit about the great painter associated with Toledo, and that is the wonderful El Greco. So this particular painting is one of his most famous, The Burial of Count Orgath, and dates from 1586. It took more than 1 year to paint. And as I'm sure most of you know, El Greco's actual name is Dominikos Theotokopoulos, born 1541 and died in 1614 in Toledo. So this painting is actually located in a church not far from the cathedral. It is not in the Cathedral of Toledo, but it is in the church of Santo Tomé, that's St. Thomas, and which is a lovely church, but this is really the sort of jewel in the crown within that church. I don't have the time to go into detail about it, but that is Count Orgoth, who this was a commission from his family, and to pay tribute to Count Orgoth, who was known for his good works and his charitable works and contributions to good Christian activities and institutions in the city. So that is him dressed in his armor and formal dress that identifies him as a noble and as a gentleman, as a knight. And he is being cradled there by these two figures in these magnificent golden robes. He is being cradled by the figure with white beard, St. Augustine, and that is St. Stephen then, who is there bareheaded and on the left. All of the figures that are down below are representative of, some of them are actually figures in the city, historical people who can be identified. They're painted with that accuracy, all of them in formal dress. Two of them are bearing the cross that identifies them as knights of Santiago, of the Order of Santiago, St. James. And then, of course, up above, notice the sort of rigid and static representation of the figures in a line in an almost linear fashion there below. But then then up above, we have the swirling mass of figures, the Holy Family, angels, robes that become these beautiful billowing clouds. And this is, of course, a representation of Count Orgoth's soul being taken up into heaven. And notice that above there in the lofty area of heaven, all is in this extremely dynamic movement. And you have the stark black and white of the formal dress below, and then the counterpoint with the beautiful gold and red and blue. So it's quite a striking and stunning masterpiece, and I hope you do get a chance to see it in person. So there is a very famous El Greco Museum, and the courtyard picture, I think, is actually a lot prettier and a lot more interesting than any sort of view of the outside. This is not the actual home in which El Greco lived. This is very much, though, a house from that same time period, from the 16th century, and the furniture and so forth that's in it is from that period as well. So in other words, this is a house that is very much like what he would have lived in. He was a very successful and famous artist during his lifetime. So this is not the story of a starving artist at all. This is a man who was extraordinarily successful. And this house may not have been the original home, but he would have had one similar to it, and which shows very much his success. I also wanted you to see the architecture, which is very typical of the period, to have this open patio on the inside, where you have a space that is both open but also is private, and you have these different galleries and doors from the rest of the house that opens onto it as the center space. And then the second story, the gallery, this sort of balcony that runs most of the way around, would have been typical of the era as well. I wanted to end with one of the paintings that is there in the El Greco Museum. Remember, the burial of Count Orgoth is in the church of Santo Tomé in the city. This painting, which is a view and map of Toledo, painted by El Greco around 1610, is in the El Greco Museum. So what I want to emphasize is obviously that El Greco has taken on a number of liberties in painting El Greco. Now, you know, this panorama should look pretty familiar to you, but you have a representation, take the river god in the left-hand side. In the forefront, there's a hospital that had recently been completed that is a sort of tribute to the charitable works of a particular religious order there in the city that he puts, you know, on the cloud, above the clouds. This is obviously a sort of aerial view. There in the sky, this is the figure of San Ildefonso, who is a sort of favorite saint. He's obviously St. James is the patron saint, but San Ildefonso, you will find representations of him everywhere in Spain. And then you have this figure in the right foreground here who's holding up a map of the city to, you know, impress you with the grandeur of this city and to sort of orient you to where you are. And we see the river almost sort of flowing into the city, leading you directly into it. And you see a little bit of this perspective. So let me just finish by saying that El Greco was actually born in what is now known as Crete, in and around the capital city of Heraclion. Crete at that point was known as Candia. It was part of the Venetian Republic. And so his early years were spent in apprenticeship. He served, well, first of all, he trained as an icon painter in Crete. And then eventually as a young man moved to Venice, of course, right, a logical move from a country or a part of what was owned by the Venetian Republic at the time. And he apprenticed under one of the greatest painters ever from Venice, and that's Titian. And there, I would say, he developed his flair for color and his experimentation with perspective. So he learned all the sort of cutting edge techniques at the time of Renaissance Italy. From there, he moved to Rome, where he was welcomed into the household of the very rich and very powerful Cardinal Farnese. And he spent about 6 years in Rome, studying and trying to establish himself as a painter there. And he developed what we think of as his Mannerist style, with these sort of these figures that twist and turn and that have the very elongated features and torsos that are supposedly convey the notion of elegance and dynamism at the same time. And he was unable to get his wealthy patrons there. So he moved in 1576 then to Toledo and very quickly established himself. He was not a favorite of Philip II, who was then the king, but he was very quickly embraced by the highest members of the church, by ecclesiastical authorities who had a lot of money to spend and a lot of power. So, and he also developed a number of patrons among the very wealthy and influential aristocracy in Toledo. And it really became his hometown without being the place where he was born. Well, welcome back to my classroom. I hope that you enjoyed our brief visit to Toledo today. And I also hope that in the very near future, I will get an opportunity to meet a number of you in person. And hopefully that we'll actually get a chance to travel someday together to the city of Toledo and see many of the other wonderful sites that are there. Toledo has been a World Heritage Site since not 1586, 1986. And so that gives you some idea of all that there is to see and do there. Thank you very much.